Good morning, guys, and welcome to today's video. About 80% of the costs associated with raising livestock is their feed bill. So I have a defined amount of acreage here, and the further that I can make this acreage go to feed these cows, the better off my operation is going to be. And that's why pasture management is so important. That's what we're talking about today on Farmer Tyler Ranch. So when we're talking about pasture management, I guess what we're really talking about is rotational grazing. Now, there's a lot of information out there on the right way or the best way to rotationally graze, so I thought I would let you guys know what I do. But before we talk about what I do, I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the different strategies of rotational grazing, which basically there's two. There's mob grazing and there's conventional grazing. Mob grazing is when you put a large amount of cattle on a small amount of acreage for a short amount of time. Conventional grazing is basically the opposite of that. You put a smaller number of cattle on a larger amount of acres for a much longer period of time. Each strategy obviously has its pros and cons. With conventional grazing, there's so much less labor. You just kick the cows out in a pasture and they're good to go for 5 or 6 months. The downside to this is that they're not nearly as efficient in the way that they graze. With mob grazing, on the other hand, since you are giving them just enough feed for one day, it sort of forces them to eat more plants that maybe they would pass up in a conventional grazing scenario. Obviously, the downside to mob grazing is there's so much more labor. I mean, you have to be out here at minimum once a day to move cows. Now, a lot of the research that I've done online points to, especially for smaller growers, that mob grazing is the only way to go, but there's a couple of things that I don't like about it. The first one being the labor. I mean, usually I'm out here every day anyway, so it's not that huge of a deal, but still moving cows every day could get to be a pain after a while. The second thing that I don't like about it is that I actually read an article that said most of the feed in a mob graze scenario gets stomped on or wasted, basically, because the cattle go into such a small area that they stomp most of it down. And the other thing that article said was that their average daily gain was less on less than 24-hour grazing intervals. So if you're watching this video, I'm only assuming that you guys have watched other grazing videos, and it probably doesn't really sound quite right that, you know, when cows go into a pasture, even though it's small, but the feed is 4 feet tall, how's their average daily gain going to be less? Because there's a lot of feed out there. But there's actually a good reason for it that I don't think some of the mob grazer proponents have considered. So to better understand this, first we need to talk a little bit about the growing or the life cycle of grass and forage. This grass here would be considered the T1 stage of growth, which means that it has just been grazed off and it's starting to regrow. So in the T1 stage, as grass is beginning to regrow, the quantity is at its least, but the nutritive value is at its most. This little patch of grass right here is a good example of what I would call T2, and the reason being that it's right around a cow pie, so they're not eating it. The second stage of growth, or also known as T2, is the best trade-off between quantity and quality. You don't have the same amount of quality as you do in T1, but in T1 you have such a low quantity that it wouldn't make sense to graze a pasture when it's in that first stage. The second stage is better because while the quality has gone down a little bit, your quantity is a lot higher. That makes sense? So the third stage of growth, you guessed it, is T3, and that would be when the grass gets a seed head and it's basically has matured as much as it's going to mature. Kind of hard to find a good example of the third growing stage out here because this is their last day in this pasture. They're actually going to move this afternoon, but that kind of grass, for whatever reason, they don't like to eat, so they let it get up into the third stage. As one might expect, the T3 stage of growing, you have the greatest amount of quantity and the lowest amount of quality. So to me, this goes back to the mob grazing scenario where you bring cows into a field where the grass is 4 feet tall. Well, it's in that third growing stage, so there might be a lot to eat out there, but the quality of that forage is not that great. So with all that being said, what do I do? Well, as I kind of hinted at before, it's sort of a combination of the two. And in fact, in the winter time when the cows are at the winter pasture, that is basically a conventional graze. They don't get any sort of rotation over there, but that's a little bit different because of the growing cycle of those grasses. So a conventional graze works in that environment. And that's the other thing to note, is that sometimes one strategy will work better at a given place than another one will. Sometimes you're limited in what you can do. So that's what I do over there. Here I do, I guess, what I would call a sort of a modified mob graze. My grazing intervals will range from 24 hours up to 6 days. Now, I'm sort of breaking a rule there because they say that you shouldn't graze any piece of ground for more than 5 days, because what happens is the cattle will just come back and eat regrowth. They won't eat new plants, which you don't want as bad. So that's something that I'm working on here. I'm hoping to get my longest grazing interval down to about 3 days or 72 hours. And so far, what I've noticed is when you get about 2 days on, 12 days off, or 12 days of recovery, that seems to work the best for me out here. This pasture that the cattle are in right now is about 12 acres, and they graze this for about 6 days. When the cattle are done here, they go into a little 1.5 acre pasture for a day. Then they'll move into an 8 acre pasture for about 4 days, and the last one they hit is a 6 acre pasture, and they're out there for around 3 days. So this rotational graze, I guess, is most similar to a mob grazing setup, but it's just not quite as intense. So I have found that hitting the pastures hard, fast, and getting out of there and letting them have more time to recover does seem to work best. But you need to keep in mind the growth stage of the grass. If you're starting to get into that third stage, then you're kind of just shooting yourself in the foot. The last thing that I would really encourage you guys to consider when you're coming up with your own grazing plan is to think about your specific environment, your specific ranch. Don't just watch some video on YouTube where someone's saying, oh, this is the only way to do it. You know, maybe that's the only way to do it where they live, but your environment could be different. Your grasses could be different. There's a lot of variables that someone posting a video on YouTube like me can't consider for you, because I don't know all the little specific things about your ranch and where you run cattle. While I was at work today, I just kind of got to thinking that doing a video about rotational grazing and pasture management just wouldn't be quite complete unless we showed the cows moving into a new pasture. I think some of you that have never seen this before might actually be kind of surprised at how easily they do this. After a while, they sort of get trained and they kind of know when it's time to move into the new pasture. Like right now, instead of being dispersed out over this field grazing, they are all piled up at the gate here waiting for me to move them. The field that they're moving into is the smallest field that they will see in this pattern. It's about 1.5 acres, and they'll be out there for just under 24 hours, about 24 hours. And as you can see, they are ready to go. Hey, bully. Finally got everybody moved in here. You know, the cows always move easy, but even this late in the year, there's always like 2 or 3 calves that just don't have the program quite figured out yet, but we got them in here now, so everybody's good. I I wanted to show you guys the grass that the cattle are coming into. So the majority of this is in the second stage, right where we want it. Actually, I can see a cow has already been through here. There's a bunch that's picked off. Some of it over here is in the third stage, but that's okay because the majority of it is right here in the second stage where we want it. In about 24 hours, when I come out here to move these cows into the next field, this pasture should be picked down so low that it'll look like a lawnmower was just out here. And at that time, they'll be ready to go out here into their next pasture to do it all over again. I think it's time to leave these girls alone and let them do what they're here to do. Thanks for hanging out in the field with me today, guys, and I hope I'll see you again on Farmer Tyler Ranch.